that I'm going to weave through the presentation. The first one, love your neighbor as yourself. Second, love your enemies and pray for them. Third, let the little children come to me. And fourth, and when you start praying, if you hold anything against anyone, forgive him. Now, I want to tell you a little bit about the backstory of how I came to study peace. As some of you know, I'm a professor at Texas State, and believe it or not, this all started by a request from the Swedish government. They asked me to write a piece called The Expeditionary Mindset and Core Values. Well, it turns out Sweden, the Netherlands, Norway, lots of countries in Europe, their militaries are deeply involved in peacekeeping operations. They lead multinational forces that move from, they're sort of like neutral umpires that begin maybe with ceasefire when things are really still kind of hot and dangerous. And the idea is to transform this situation that is warlike into a working, functional society. Well, these countries found that there's a little problem they were having, and that was the military was responsible for a lot of this. And at the front end, it was really helpful to have a warrior mindset. But the warrior mindset became problematic as they had to move into stabilization and creating institutions that would be peaceful, or help working on that. So ideally, this was, warriors think friend, enemy, victory, defeat, war, peace. It's it's a little more black and white, and it needs to be when you're doing like traditional sort of warrior activities. But when you're moving in and leading peace operations, maybe you should, somehow, a lot of mistakes were made because warriors were bringing their warrior ethos to the peace situation. So help us. I was part of a group of people who were trying to think about what kind of mindset militaries that were engaged in this kind of activity should have. And I just really thought that was a very intriguing question. And when it was time for my sabbatical last spring, and I'd already studied the ideas of Jane Addams in another context, but I knew that she had written a lot on peace, and I hadn't looked at that. And I thought, well, you know, this is my last big push as a scholar, diving into something new, because I'm in my 60s. So I'm going to go and I'm going to study Jane Addams' ideas, and I'm going to study peace. And I'm going to try and make something of that. So I'm going to talk about a little bit about who Jane Addams is. There's some pictures of her. And then I'm going to talk about her ideas. So she was born during the Civil War in 1864, and she died in 1935. She's the first woman in the United States to win the Nobel Peace Prize. In her early years, when she was in her late 20s and most of the rest of her life, she was involved in something called the settlement movement, which this was a period, the 1890s, there was a lot of immigration, there was urbanization, there was industrialization movement from the farms to the cities, and there were a lot of problems in the cities. So this was a way to try to deal with the problems of the city. People she was responsible or headed something called Hull House, which was, the best I can describe it, and it's hard to describe, a huge community center that tried to work with the community to bring about changes. And they did need serious changes, because for just example, what did the kids play on sometimes? I mean, it was horse carcasses. Now, I guess that wouldn't be that healthy to have your kids playing on horse carcasses. So there are lots of problems. Anyway, so the whole house was in Chicago. Chicago at that time was 75% of its residents were immigrants. And these immigrants mostly came from Europe, and they brought with them their hostilities from the different countries. There were religious hostilities, and there was just centuries of those countries fighting one another. So in some sort of weird way, you have, and this community had to work. You had to love your neighbor, because they were now neighbors, and love your enemy, because they had historical kind of enmity between them. But they thought of Hull House, and what they said, the settlement was an experimental effort to aid in the solutions of the problems engendered of modern conditions in a great city. So the modern conditions were the horse carcasses. But anyway, she considered this sort of a laboratory to understand conflict. And her ideas of peace grew out of her work in the settlement movement, trying to create anyway, there was a lot of things that she was involved in as a progressive reformer, working about child labor laws. She brought playgrounds to Chicago, healthier workplaces. There's problems with typhoid and inside the garments. She worked on juvenile courts, cleaning the streets, sanitation and sewer. And there's also another immigration that came up from the South, and that was African Americans moving into getting jobs in the North. And she actually was a founder of the NAACP. She was a noted speaker and author. She wrote 11 books, and I read a lot of her books that semester. And she was fought for women, and she particularly was interested in expanding the woman's sphere beyond the home. Now, she thought the home and caring was fine, but it would be helpful that women shouldn't be restricted to the home. And in fact, sometimes if you wanted to be really care for your family, you might actually work for progressive reform, like better garbage collection, or etc. So she also was involved in engaging women in different peace movements. And so she was a peace activist. She wrote books on peace. She organized peace organizations. During World War I, before we entered World War I, she organized and led a women's peace conference at The Hague, and after that traveled around Europe talking to leaders in the belligerent countries, trying to get them to mediate. And those were some of the things that led to her Nobel Peace Prize. Now let me just detour a moment to the peace literature. And when I was reading it, there's one article just stuck in my mind, and here's the title: Peace Research, Just the Study of War. What does this mean? Well, that means that peace has been defined in two ways. One is a negative notion of peace, which is the absence of war, and the other is a positive notion of peace. And it turns out the peace researchers have been studying the negative definition of peace so much, and they did this big study of all the research on peace, that mostly the study of peace is a study of war. Well, that just seemed crazy to me, and it also seemed like Jane Addams and what her ideas and what I've been reading is an example of a positive peace. And that we needed a richer, deeper, more wonderful sense of what positive peace is if the peace research is just a study of war. So that was what kind of led me into thinking this was really important. Now I want to focus on her key ideas of peace. First of all, she focuses on relationships. That violent conflict is a broken relationship. Peace is a loving, working, caring relationship. Love your neighbor. Love your enemy. Forgive. every single one of those is a relationship that should be fixed, or maybe not should be fixed, but the emphasis is a relationship. Now, another thing that she was concerned about or looked at as sort of problematic was a fixed or a mindset or a rigid moralism. That if people brought rigid moralisms with them, then it was almost impossible for them to do what was really important. She thought sympathetic understanding. And that's probably one of her linchpin concepts. What does it mean to love your neighbor or love your enemy? What does it actually mean? How do you do that? Well, sympathetic understanding kind of answers that. It says, let's put yourself in the sense of the other person. Walk in their shoes. And sympathetic understanding would also be an openness to listen, to suspend judgment, and it's just the opposite of rigid dogmatism. Another is to bring to that relationship kindness. If you have sympathetic understanding, you think about walking in someone other's shoes, but with a sense of kindness. And also, I think there's a willingness to forgive. Forgiveness is part of loving your neighbor, loving your enemy, for sure. And then I think another one is she recognized that this could actually take courage. Now, how could that take courage? Well, if you are part of a group that has a pretty strong rigid mindset, and part of that rigid mindset is the other guy's the enemy, if you're going to open your heart to see what is his experience like, how can I bring sympathetic understanding to him, then you are risking other people not wanting you around because you're moving over to the enemy. So it's loving your neighbor and loving your enemy is a courageous act, or can be. Another thing that she brought up was the community of inquiry. So in a way, this is opening the space so that we can build relationships. And how do we build relationships? We don't build them by my having what's right and you having what's wrong and me connecting to you saying, you will learn what I know is right. It might be by having practical problems that you can try to work on. So the first part of the community of inquiry is that you find practical problems so that you can talk about something other or something that's constructive. Then you bring to those practical problems something like a scientific attitude, which basically means you're open to try to be objective. Not that you are objective necessarily, but you've got a goal for objectivity and looking at evidence. And then the final one is called participatory democracy. And here's where everyone who is concerned about the problem should have a voice. They should be listened to. Love your neighbor. And a lot of times when we have problems, we have experts. Now, experts are important, for sure. We should listen to experts. But the metaphor of the shoemaker and the shoe comes in. The shoemaker is an expert at making the shoe, but you know where it pinches. So both are very important. In terms of this community of inquiry, that is the openness to solving practical problems. The focus is the group solving practical problems. The next key concept in her PeaceWeaving, or in her ideas, are lateral progress, which means you measure how well people are doing, by the welfare of the people at the bottom. So this is where let the children come to me, the most vulnerable, the women and sick. And if we think about what Jesus and his focus, it was right there. How can we move how can we acknowledge these and bring these people up? She also had something that was sort of interesting called the civic household. And what she saw as the model of government in Chicago at the time was kind of military. She called it militaristic, and part of it was there was a social Darwinism was a theme at that point, and a lot of people believed there were militaristic societies and they moved to industrial societies. And a city was a citadel. It needed to protect itself, sort of organically. That's how things were centuries ago, thousands of years ago. And soldiers were valued, and mostly women weren't valued because women weren't used to protect. But now we don't have those problems anymore. Why don't we move to thinking about a city more like a household? And if you have when you have a city as a citadel, you really don't care about health, you don't care about children, you don't care about the vulnerable. But when you think of it as a household, you care about health, you care about the poor, children, you care about the sick, you care about the elderly, and we should move and organize cities in a way that we can create the spaces to do this, and the metaphor of civic household was another metaphor for creating working spaces so you can love your neighbor and love your enemy. Now, her ideas of peace sort of began in the family, could move out. I guess I forgot another thing that Jana, that I was supposed to say about her and just forgot, that she was very much a Christian and modeled her life. I thought Jesus offered a fabulous model for living, and also the early Christians. So part of the settlement movement was kind of modeled on the lives of the early Christians. But these ideas of peace about relationships and lateral progress and community of inquiry, they started with Chicago. They started with her experiences in the neighborhoods of Chicago, and they moved out from community to nation to world. Now, when she, in 1915, when she worked with the Peace Conference, there were three things that kind of came out of that I want to share with you. One is she really pushed for women throughout the world to have a franchise, but also to be engaged in the peace process. The second was we should bring sympathetic understanding towards the enemy. That when peace finally did come, that it was important for us to remember to love our enemy and forgive. And that if we brought ideas of victory and vanquished, defeated, how can we, which is actually what happened in World War I, unfortunately, but that would be helpful to bring those ideas to the process of negotiating a peace. And then the other is practical problems. That after the war, there was just starvation in Europe. And she and Herbert Hoover led this, but she was very close to Herbert Hoover, led humanitarian interventions to feed the hungry children of Europe. Love your enemies and children. So PeaceWeaving, here's what I came up as a definition. It's building the fabric of peace by emphasizing relationships. These positive relationships are built by working on practical problems, engaging people widely with sympathetic understanding, while recognizing that progress is measured by the welfare of the vulnerable. Love your neighbor. Love your enemy. Care for children and forgive.